growing black hole. I'm joined by the former Chancellor, Lord Lawson, the political economist and biographer of John Maynard Keynes, Lord Skidelsky, the head of the Economic and Social Affairs of the Trade Union Congress, Nicholas Smith, and Ruth Porter of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Lord Lawson, is this the moment for the government to rethink what it can do for us and for us to think what the government should be doing for us?
Your disaster scenario may or may not prove the case. Nobody knows. It's quite impossible to do this sort of prediction. Nevertheless, it's right to be cautious. It could happen like that. And so I do think that the government is absolutely right now to be engaged in major fiscal consolidation, reducing the deficit, because in addition to the immediate crisis which they inherited, there is this long-term problem.
Yeah, and there's the
so
long-term
it's right to be on that path.
Yeah, it is the long-term problem that we're addressing, and however much you might want to alleviate problems today, the fact is that demographics are going to rule out a lot of options, aren't they?
Well, whatever the crisis is in the long term, in the long-term structure of these services we've been talking about, but it'll be much easier to manage if we get some growth in the economy. That won't solve all of them. You'll still need reforms, but growth is an essential a necessary condition. And my criticism of what's happening now is that there's no growth policy.
Yes, well, the kind of debt versus growth scenario isn't playing out well at the moment.
Well, I wouldn't say it was debt versus growth. I would say growth is a way of reducing the debt in the long term.
Ruth?
We need to look at the context here, and actually what's interesting about the current situation is that we're already in an unsustainable area. So the government's spending more than 50% of GDP, and more than half of that is going on welfare at the moment. If you then factor in the demographic changes and you fast forward, by the time you get to, say, if you take 2030, you know, for the average girl who's born that year, her life expectancy will be 95. And you factor in the additional costs and the strains which that is going to put on our health spending, on our state pensions, and it is unsustainable.
So, Nicola, there'll be radical welfare reform, because that's really what's needed. I mean, actuarially, that's going to be what's needed.
Well, I think I disagree with the way that Ruth's presented the situation, because clearly there are going to be real challenges for the public finances going forward. But as you said at the end of your broadcast there, this is by no means a zero-sum game. What we have are huge uncertainties in the forecast based on, firstly, how many people we have moving into work, but secondly, how productive our economy is,
yes,
and also crucially how much revenue we
also know
choose to
we're going to
raise.
have fewer revenues. The money from North Sea Oil is going to run out. The fact is we're going to have people living longer who are going to need more social care, who are going to make more demands on the state pension, and we're not going to be able to pay.
There's clearly big demographic challenges going forward, but growth is absolutely by no means a zero-sum game. There are huge opportunities when we're going forward. Over the last 30 years, the UK's levels of investment into the economy have been amongst the lowest in the G7. If we can turn that around, we've got real opportunities to grow the economy going forward.
But the government should just accrue debt, because that's really what you think is the only way to do it.
The only way to get sustainable public finances in the long term is to secure stronger growth for the long term going forward. We need to be ambitious about becoming the strongest competitor in green economies across the world. We need to think about how we can really.
But the reality is we're in low to slow growth.
That's right. No, this is a well-known road to disaster. To assume that you're going to get greater growth, and we don't like to see it, but to assume that you're going to get greater growth and allow public expenditure plans to be based on that, and then of course if you don't get the growth, and you might not, then the public is a disaster. But there's plenty to be done. You take the ageing of the population, which is what you've been focusing on particularly, quite rightly. The age of retirement has got to go substantially higher. I mean, I'm 80 and still working.
And what age are you, Lord Skidelsky?
72.
You're both still working?
I'm working, yes, and I know Nigel is working.
I'm absolutely.
Oh, that's very interesting, because you're both still working. So
that's
therefore,
right.
What about? Do you claim your winter fuel allowance?
Of course.
Do you claim your winter fuel allowance?
Yes, I think I do.
I think you do.
But I don't claim my own. I don't claim my old age pension.
But anyhow, the age of the government has said it would increase the age of retirement, but they're not nearly enough.
So you think it needs to be a much more radical plan?
It needs to go much higher. And in terms of health, because obviously increasingly an older population makes more demand for those services, you've got to have charges.
Well, we're going to talk about that in just a second, but let's just on this question of retirement.
Yeah.
Nicola, the idea that people are going to retire successively at 66, 68 and a half, that is just tinkering, isn't it? People are healthy, people are able to contribute to society, we should be retiring at 70.
It's the idea of removing the state pension from people at a higher age than they have at the moment is fundamentally unfair and misguided.
Why?
When we're talking about retirement age, that is in no way tied to the state pension as well. Firstly, because when you move the state pension age higher, what you do is you deny people who have been on the lowest incomes all their life and have got a far lower life expectancy, a far larger proportion of their state pension than the wealthy people we have in the UK.
I mean, it's burying our heads in the sand. What we need to actually be doing is even looking at far more radical solutions, which are more long-term, and saying we need flexibility. Different people will want to retire at different ages.
Absolutely.
We could look at as an alternative phasing out the state pension and introducing compulsory saving.
I think we should make it financially possible for people to choose their age of retirement and not be penalised if they go on working. But there is another alternative. We've all been assuming that there's a simple tax limit, which is roughly what we've got. In fact, people now want to reduce the top rate. We can increase taxes. That is an option. But I'm not saying it's a politically acceptable option.
Well, we'll come
but
on
in
to
economic
talk about tax.
It's certainly an option.
And I do want to come on to talk about tax. But if you look at health, social care, state pension, half public spending goes in all these, universality of contributions. We're going to have to end this, are we? We don't have this universality of contributions. Perhaps you could opt out of certain ones if you're not using the state provision.
Kirsty, if I could just say, I mean, the actual level of spending on social security has remained pretty much constant as a proportion of GDP since the formation of the modern welfare state. It's not rising any more quickly now than it has been. And in fact, the period when it started rising more slowly was when we had higher employment growth, which meant social security contributions went down. Already the government's lower growth forecast over the last year has led to about 50 billion more being spent on social security. The way to get social security spending down is to try and get more people into work.
Yeah, well, obviously there is that relationship. I mean, the fuller the employment of the economy on the whole, the smaller the bills for unemployment benefit and other kinds of benefit. But that doesn't affect the main spending items for economic growth, which are health, education.
Well, let's talk about health particularly because the exponential rise of that, because, of course, there are new treatments and so forth, and also people are living longer. People are also attracting, at the moment, there are definite issues about whether or not people should be taking care of their own health and should be penalised if they don't. Do you think we'll move to a situation where, for example, where diabetes is going to rise, by 50%, that there'll be an onus on people to marshal their own health?
If we want to see access to a good quality of things like healthcare and other services, we need to move in all these areas to allowing people to take more responsibility. And so we do need to look at things like reducing demand by introducing, for example, small charges when you go to A&E or you go to the GP to make people think twice.
What about the idea of co-payments? Charles Clark was talking about that, either being to see a different doctor or even for motorway tolls, that actually people are going to have to take more responsibility for paying for the kind of things they want to have.
Well, we'll find some way, and I think charging has got to be more than... I mean, there is now less proportion financed through charges than when an Aaron Bevans first set the health service up. It is absolutely absurd. So there has got to be charges, and the charging, and of course the poorest will not have to pay the charges. Yeah. Well, there'll always be a safety net for the poorest. But what happens is if you will also reduce to some extent the demand if you have charging. So you have a double benefit, and that is going to have to come. You have a double benefit, and that is going to have to come.
It's charging or rationing, isn't it?
We know what charging means. Charging means reducing services for people across the economy. People in the UK don't want poor people not to be able to access healthcare. They don't want a situation that we have in America where people can't. Where people can't move from. In America, people can't move from work, from welfare into work because they can't afford to lose the free healthcare they get.
If hard choices are going to have to be made to save the central elements of the NHS, then we're going to have to move to a different model.
Well, I would say the hard choices are.
I think we've got three options. I mean, we can raise taxes, we can introduce charges, and we can have better control over people's lifestyles. I mean, encourage them to lead healthier lives. And somewhere between those three, we're going to find a solution. And I don't know, in what proportions.
What about taxation coming on to actually wholesale reform of taxation? We've heard everything from, a tycoon tax to a land tax to a mansion tax. That's just tinkering, isn't it?
Well, I think we need to look overall at actually, I mean, the point that was made earlier about economic growth, we're actually not going to see growth in the economy until we do cut the public sector down.
Why?
And we do. Because we need space for the private sector to do well. And we need to have the room for tax cuts, which at the moment we don't have. I think actually looking at the demographics of it, you know, the government should really be aiming to get the size of the state down to 30%, would allow massive tax cuts across the board, and then we would see savings.
But what happens while you're doing it? What happens while you're in the course of...
We'll phase it in, but unless we build a savings culture, we're not going to be able to tackle these problems.
The idea that the public sector is squeezing out the private sector at the moment is utterly ridiculous. The public sector is currently losing jobs at a rate which is far higher than the private sector is creating them. There is one private sector job being created for every 13 public sector jobs being lost. And Great Britain is sitting on surpluses of around 50% of GDP.
Theoretical. Look, well, I don't want to sort of hark back, but we have been through this before, and during my time as Chancellor, I cut tax rates.
But you decided not to have a sovereign wealth fund. That would have given us a piggy bank.
Tough policy on public spending. We got growth, and we got a budget surplus. So, I mean, you can do it.
Looking back, do you wish that you put in place a sovereign wealth fund like Norway has now?
No, we're not remotely like Norway. Norway has got a massive North Sea oil and gas industry, which is a huge proportion of its economy. For us, it was never more than 5% of the peak.
And just to finish off, Lord Lawson, on the news tonight that's in the front of the FT, I'm afraid I think we're just about out of time, but on the news tonight from one of the planes travelling to America with the Chancellor and the Prime Minister is they've dreamt up the idea of a 100-year bond. Good idea?
Well, if people are prepared to buy it, why not?
Are they prepared to buy it? Do you think they're going to put their faith in it?
Well, I don't know whether this is going to happen. We shall see. You try to test the market. But there's a lot of nonsense to be cut out of public spending. If we don't go ahead with high-speed rail, for example, that would be a good start.
100-year bond?
Well, yeah, we'll have to see. I mean, I suppose it's an attempt to get the yield up of government debt, but I don't know. I only heard about it a minute ago.
Thank you all very much indeed.